A father working a good middle-class job walked into a grocery store with his son. 10 years earlier, that same salary bought a house, family vacations, savings, healthcare, and stability. Now, he stared at the price of eggs, rent, insurance, and electricity, wondering how he was somehow earning more money, while feeling poorer every year. And that confusion is happening to millions of people around the world right now. Because the middle class is not collapsing all at once, it is being slowly crushed in silence. If you are watching this and feel like life is getting more expensive no matter how hard you work, comment the word "squeezed" below. Because what you are about to hear explains why millions of middle-class families feel trapped, and why the wealthy are quietly moving their money before everyone else notices what is happening. The first thing you need to understand is this. Most people think income creates wealth. It does not. Assets create wealth. And that single misunderstanding is destroying the middle class. For decades, the middle class formula looked simple. Get a stable job, buy a house, save money, retire safely. That system worked when housing was affordable, wages kept rising, education costs were manageable, and inflation stayed relatively low. But the economic world changed, and the middle class never adapted fast enough. Today, many households are earning more money on paper, while becoming poorer in reality. Analysts increasingly warn that inflation in essential categories like housing, healthcare, insurance, childcare, and education has dramatically outpaced wage growth. That means people are running faster financially just to stay in the same place. One recent analysis called it the nominal wage trap. Salaries rise, but purchasing power quietly shrinks underneath inflation. And honestly, that may be the most dangerous financial illusion of modern life. Because people think, my salary increased, so I'm doing better. Meanwhile, rent doubled, groceries exploded, insurance skyrocketed, property taxes climbed, and debt payments expanded. The paycheck grows, but the life attached to that paycheck shrinks. And this is where the middle class begins disappearing. Not through one dramatic collapse, but through slow financial suffocation. One Reddit user recently described it perfectly. Housing, groceries, insurance, rent, and healthcare all exploded in price. That sentence explains why so many people feel anxious despite working harder than ever. And what happened next made things even worse. The wealthy adapted to inflation. The middle class did not. Because wealthy people usually own appreciating assets, businesses, stocks, real estate, infrastructure, commodities. When inflation rises, those assets often rise too. But middle-class families mostly depend on wages, and wages usually react slower than inflation. That creates a hidden wealth transfer. One discussion about the shrinking middle class explained that inflation acts like a transfer from people without assets to people who already own them. And once you understand that, everything changes. Because the rich do not simply earn more. They own things that become more valuable while the middle class works harder to survive rising costs. This is why asset ownership matters more than salary growth. And the housing market reveals this crisis brutally. For previous generations, buying a home was difficult but achievable. Today, many young families feel permanently locked out. Home prices and rent have surged far faster than wages in many regions, forcing families to spend enormous portions of income just on shelter. And here is the terrifying part. When housing becomes unaffordable, savings collapse, investing becomes harder, birth rates decline, stress increases, and long-term wealth building becomes almost impossible. Because housing was historically the middle class's biggest wealth-building tool. Without asset growth, families stay trapped on the income treadmill forever, and debt quietly deepens the problem. Credit cards, student loans, car payments, buy now, pay later systems. Modern economies increasingly depend on consumers borrowing money to maintain lifestyles inflation already destroyed. That creates an illusion of stability. But underneath it, many households are financially fragile. One report warned that middle-class families increasingly rely on debt simply to maintain normal living standards. That is why people feel exhausted even while appearing middle-class from the outside. The lifestyle remains. The financial foundation underneath it weakens. And this leads to the biggest mistake ordinary people make during economic shifts. They keep all their money in cash savings. Emotionally, cash feels safe. But during inflationary periods, Idle cash quietly loses purchasing power every single year. Financial experts increasingly warn that excessive cash holdings become dangerous during sustained inflation, because money itself buys less over time. That means many middle-class savers are technically losing wealth even while their bank balance stays the same. And wealthy investors understand this extremely well, which is why they are quietly repositioning their money right now. One report tracking millionaire capital flows found wealthy investors increasingly moving money toward real assets, infrastructure, private equity, commodities, real estate, and inflation-resistant investments. Why? Because the wealthy know something most people do not. Inflation changes the rules of survival. And according to major institutions like JP Morgan, the world may be entering a long era of recurring inflation shocks rather than stable low inflation. That changes everything. Because traditional middle-class financial advice was built for a different economy. Saving cash alone is no longer enough. Now, before people panic, this does not mean gambling on risky investments or chasing internet hype. That decision destroys people too. But it does mean understanding where money historically survives during inflationary periods. The first place smart money moves is productive assets. Not fantasy. Not speculation. Real productive assets. Things that generate value even during economic stress. Dividend-paying businesses, infrastructure, energy, utilities, farmland, rental property, and broad stock ownership. One recession preparation report explained that wealthy investors increasingly favor. Gold remains one of the oldest examples. Recently, major investors like Jeffrey Gundlach warned that inflation risks remain elevated and recommended larger allocations toward gold, commodities, and hard assets. Why? Because paper currency weakens during inflationary cycles. Hard assets often retain value better. Now, this does not mean putting all your money into gold, but it does mean understanding that diversified asset ownership matters more than ever. One income stream is enough, and one savings account solves everything. That system worked in a more stable economy. But modern wealth increasingly rewards flexibility, ownership, and adaptability. And there is another uncomfortable truth nobody wants to hear. Technology is accelerating this divide. AI, automation, and global competition are making many middle-income jobs less valuable over time. Meanwhile, people who own technology platforms, capital, data, and scalable businesses continue gaining wealth faster. That creates what economists increasingly describe as a barbell economy: high-income asset owners at the top, financially struggling workers at the bottom, and a shrinking stable middle in between. One academic analysis even describes societies splitting into widening economic extremes while the middle weakens. That sounds dramatic, but many families already feel it emotionally. And this is where people make another fatal mistake. The middle class was originally built through ownership. Somewhere along the way, many people became consumers instead of owners. And consumers are extremely vulnerable during inflationary systems. But there is one final truth most people still do not understand. The middle class is not disappearing equally everywhere. Some people are actually moving upward. Several analysts argue that part of the middle class shrinkage comes from some households moving into higher income groups. But the divide between asset owners and non-owners is widening dramatically. That is the real story, not simply rich versus poor. That may be the single biggest financial transition of this generation, because the people who survive economic change are usually not the smartest. They are the ones who adapt before everyone else realizes the rules changed.